She was known in her family for being able to fix things. She grabbed the toaster and took it up to her room and decided she was going to take it apart and figure out why it wasn't working.
Oh my good. Who does that?
I know. She was young. She was maybe 9.
I'm Katie Hafner, and this is Lost Women of Science. We're calling this season the First Lady of Engineering. It's about Yvonne Young Clark, who we'll come to know by her nickname YY. From day one at Lost Women of Science, we set out to include female scientists in all their diversity. Anyone who's seen Hidden Figures or read the book knows that female scientists are a wonderfully diverse group and always were. Our producer, Sophie McNulty, found YY in a book titled Black Women Scientists in the United States by Winnie Warren. The chapter was about a mechanical engineer named Yvonne Young Clark, whose passion for tinkering led to a brilliant career in both industry and academia. Around that time, we'd gotten interested in this idea of chains of knowledge and the importance, to this day, of female mentors for young women in science, and we thought dedicating a full season to someone who made teaching and mentoring a huge part of her mission might be fascinating. And we were right.
She was the first African-American female faculty member, as well as the first African-American engineering female department head at Tennessee State. So when she was around, it was like, you walked different, you acted different.
You walk down the hall, Baker. I'm like, yes, ma'am.
YY was beloved in her circles and well beyond. In 1964, Ebony magazine ran a big profile of her. Among students and fellow engineers, she was a celebrity, a legend even. When I first looked up YY, I found a slew of firsts. She was the first woman to get a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Howard University, the first African-American woman engineer hired at RCA Victor, the first African-American member of the Society of Women Engineers, the first woman to earn a master's degree in engineering management from Vanderbilt University. I learned that at NASA, she worked on engines for the Saturn V rocket, which launched the first astronauts to the moon. She helped design the sealed boxes that transported moon rocks back to Earth. And most of this work she did over summer breaks, because during the academic year, YY was teaching. She taught mechanical engineering for 55 years at Tennessee State, a historically Black university in Nashville. She inspired generations of young Black engineers, both men and women.
So I fully expected it would be someone that I would have some familiarity with. I mean, I've got a fairly good knowledge of African-American history, and
That's Carol Sutton Lewis, the same person you heard at the very beginning. Carol and I have been tracking down YY's story together and having weekly phone calls to touch base.
And what's been really interesting is as we have delved into her story as a mechanical engineer and as a Black woman in the South, a lot of what we find comes back to her family.
To tell YY's story, which is in many ways a family story, Carol is joining me as co-host this season. She has a background as a lawyer, and she hosts her own podcast called Ground Control Parenting, which is a series of conversations about parenting Black and brown children. Carol did the bulk of the reporting about YY Clark. So Carol, YY's story is one of multitudes. Where did you start?
So the first thing I did was I went to Seattle to meet YY's daughter, Carol Lawson.
Let me get this, put this in here.
Carol came to the Airbnb where I was staying. She pulled up in her car with stacks of materials she had on her mom.
Actually, you know what? Let me give you this book. We'll put this right here. Yeah.
Carol laid out all the books and papers on a table, and once we sat down, we dove into the photos.
That's Mom.
Oh, wow, at Redstone Arsenal in 1964. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
It's a black and white shot of YY standing next to a rocket with U.S. Army stenciled on the side, and she is beaming. She's wearing a cute sleeveless dress and heels.
There's
There's her and Hortense.
Oh, this one's a baby picture. Little Yvonne on her mother's lap.
And look at the pearls. She's holding her mother's pearls.
YY was born Georgiana Yvonne Young on April 13, 1929, in Houston, Texas. She was named after two of her great aunts, Georgia and Anna, but she went by her middle name Yvonne. Right from the start, Yvonne showed an interest in all things mechanical.
Erector, the all-steel construction set for beginners, for young builders, for junior engineers.
YY loved her Lincoln Logs and her Erector set, toys that were, at the time, exclusively marketed to boys.
It has exciting appeal for all boys.
YY's early engineering projects weren't limited to her toys. In one of our weekly calls, Carol told me about one moment that might have been the pivotal one for YY's career trajectory. It's time to explain what happened with that toaster.
The family toaster stopped working. Mm-hmm. The toast was burning on one side and not heating up on the other. And her father said to the housekeeper, we'll get a new one. And YY grabbed the toaster and took it up to her room and decided she was going to take it apart and figure out why it wasn't working. And so she fixed it, and she didn't tell anyone. She snuck it back down into the kitchen. The next morning, YY woke up to the smell of toast, and she ran downstairs just in time to witness the housekeeper saying to YY's father, "Wow, you got a new toaster really quickly," to which YY's father responded, "I didn't buy a new toaster." And he determined that YY had fixed it.
After a quick fire safety talk, he told her how impressed he was.
Doesn't it speak volumes about her father, too?
Oh, absolutely. The family's perspective was, if you want to do this, let's figure out how you do this, and we'll support you doing it.
YY's family would make all the difference when it came to nurturing her interests and eventually helping her build a career.
Her mother, Hortense Houston Young, grew up in Texas.
She went to Fisk.
That's Fisk University, a historically black college in Nashville.
Majored in English.
And then got a second bachelor's degree in library science from the University of Illinois.
And she also married my grandfather, Dr. C. Milton Young.
YY's father, Dr. Coleman Milton Young, studied medicine at Fisk, and the family eventually moved to Louisville, Kentucky.
They lived in the 800 block, 818 South 6th Street. So the traditional black business district would have been about 5 blocks to the north.
Tom Owen is an archivist at the University of Louisville. Carol and I sat down to talk to him about his true passion, the city of Louisville itself.
I'm 82 years old. I still do walking tours, bicycle tours. That's about it. A Louisville native.
Tom told us he often bikes past YY's old block. It's auto shops and massage parlors now, but back in the 30s, it was a row of brick, shotgun-style houses where upper-middle-class black families lived.
Yvonne was raised in a family that would have been among the most comfortable African-American families here in Louisville.
The Youngs hosted derby parties and political fundraisers. YY's father, the doctor,
he was on the staff of the private African-American hospital called Red Cross Hospital, and he was chief of staff for a season. He also was the physician at Louisville Municipal, which was a racially separate undergraduate college of the University of Louisville.
Hortense worked at the university, too, as a librarian. She also wrote a newspaper column for the Louisville Defender. It was called Tense Topics, both because her nickname was Tense and because she wrote about the issues that riled her up most: segregation, housing discrimination, and civil rights. 1930s Louisville gave her plenty to work with. At the time, there was only one department store in Louisville where black customers could try on clothes. YY's school, like all schools, was segregated, and black residents lived with the constant threat of racist violence, including the threat of lynchings.
It's not a pretty picture.
This was the world YY and her younger brother Milton were brought up in. a segregated city in the segregated South at the start of the Great Depression. YY would need more than a knack for machinery to make it as an engineer. Her daughter Carol points to two sources of strength YY drew from. The first was that from a very early age,
She was a congenital stutterer.
when YY started school, she stuttered. And as you might imagine, the reactions from other children were not kind. It reached a point where YY practically stopped talking in her classes.
That was an early introduction to not discrimination, but ill feelings from other humans for no reason.
But YY got something out of all of this, something Carol calls her rhino skin.
When you're subjected to that at an early age, you start to learn a lot about humans and recognizing that's your problem. I'm not wrong. That's your problem. I got to slow down what I have to say so I can be clear, but I am right. Just because I stutter doesn't mean I'm wrong.
The second source of YY's strength takes a little more explaining. When Carol started showing me the books she'd brought, I quickly discovered
Most of them are about her family.
YY's family has a fascinating history, and it's recorded.
This is the Precious Memories of a Black Socialite, a narrative of the life and times of Constance Houston Thompson. Who's she? She's my mom's mother's sister.
Carol had all these books about her mother's relatives, and they went back multiple generations.
And so this one is the movement of rural African Americans to Houston, speaking specifically about the Houston family.
YY's family on her mother's side were Houstons, and the reason they had the last name Houston?
So the book is about the legacy of the slaves of Sam Houston.
General Sam Houston, founding father of Texas, reason why the city of Houston is called Houston, owned slaves. And one of the men he enslaved was
Joshua Houston.
YY's great-grandfather.
Our ancestors were, by law, they were owned by other people, right? They were property, they were commodities, they were chattel.
That's Henry Louis Gates Jr., or as he's called by many, Skip Gates.
In reality, they were human beings fighting for their humanity, just as Joshua Houston Sr. was.
Skip Gates is a historian, professor, and literary critic who serves as the director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. You might know him as the host of the PBS series Finding Your Roots. Like me, he was interested to discover YY's lineage and to learn about Joshua Houston.
You know, he's been written about.
YY's great-grandfather, Joshua Houston, was born into slavery in 1822 in Alabama. And one of the first things I learned about him was that he could read and write. This was at a time when in many southern states that was illegal.
In Joshua Houston's case, he participated in Bible study while owned by his first master and mistress, Temple and Nancy Lee. When Temple Lee died, he left Joshua to his daughter Margaret. And as you know, Margaret would marry Sam Houston.
Their marriage is how Joshua Houston wound up in Texas with the last name Houston. His education meant that following the Civil War and emancipation, Joshua was in a better position to pursue life as a free man. He bought property and opened his own blacksmith shop. This was during the time known as Reconstruction, in the years after the war.
The hallmarks of Reconstruction were the ratification of what we now call the Reconstruction Constitutional Amendments. The 13th Amendment,
which ended slavery.
The 14th Amendment,
which established birthright citizenship and gave all U.S. citizens equal protection under the law.
And then finally, the 15th Amendment, which gave all Black men the right to vote.
A right that was unprecedented and eagerly exercised.
The first freedom summer, as I put it, was the summer of 1867, when all those Black men, formerly enslaved and free, got the right to vote. They registered to vote in that first freedom summer, 80%. Think about that.
And some of them ran for office, including Joshua Houston.
He was a city alderman in Huntsville, Texas, in 1867 and in 1870. And he won election as a county commissioner in 1878 and in 1882.
Joshua went on to have 8 children, and he made sure they also had access to education and opportunities. One of his sons went to Howard University and ultimately founded a school, the first African-American school in Texas to go to the 12th grade. The Houston children were politically engaged, college-educated, and they owned property.
And so I did some research, and about 20% of the Black community was able to own property by 1900.
Which means, of course, 80% didn't. The Houstons were part of a small, privileged class of Black people that flourished during Reconstruction.
So we've always had these class divisions within the African American community.
The Houston family history illuminates a part of Black history that often gets lost, and that is the history of Black prosperity. Still, their relative privilege didn't end the reality of racism or the potential for violence, especially because in the wake of the expansion of rights during Reconstruction, there was a brutal backlash.
The Freedmen's Bureau in Texas has a register of murders listing over 1,000 in the year between 1865 and 1866.
Black people faced a constant terrorist threat.
So vigilante violence, in other words, was a continuous part of Reconstruction.
And soon, the legislative rollback began. Laws were put into place to reestablish a system of economic and political disenfranchisement for Black Americans. This was the so-called redemption of the Southern states.
And it has that funny name because these racists saying they were redeeming the purity of the South because of the evils of what they called Negro rule.
Reconstruction and its early promise of expanding rights collapsed in 1877 when federal troops pulled out of the South.
Then it was those federal troops that were guaranteeing the right of Black men to vote in the South.
Without that guarantee, it became all too easy for the so-called redeemers to strictly enforce segregation. For Black Americans like YY's family, this meant forging their own world.
If you lifted up the curtain, the color curtain, Black people under segregation were not saying, woe is me, and not, begging for admission into the white world. They formed a rich and various and diverse and nurturing Black world that had deep roots and sustained us.
YY's relatives were exemplars of this legacy. They gathered in Black fraternities and sororities, at cotillions, bridge parties. They created strong, resilient communities and found ways to thrive. Her family included journalists, doctors, cooks, teachers.
And she knew them. Mm-hmm. They weren't mythical people on the wall that I've seen and, and Grandma told me a story. No, she knew those people.
This was the second source of YY's strength.
And it helps you understand why Yvonne was the way Yvonne was, or YY was the way she was. They were all about promoting, protecting, and uplifting Black folk. 110%.
Coming up, YY's family needs to put up a fight.
Don't do anything wrong to Black folks, because we're going to come get you.
I am Yvonne Y. Clark, 78. Today's date is October the 26th, 2007, Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm being interviewed by my daughter.
That's YY you're hearing. This tape is from a StoryCorps interview she recorded with her daughter, Carol Lawson. YY died in 2019, a few months shy of 90 years old.
So, Yvonne, Mom.
Thank you.
Tell me, why did you want to become an engineer?
I wanted to ferry airplanes between the United States and England.
This was the early 1940s, and the U.S. had just entered World War II. The Youngs opened up their Louisville home to the Black military personnel based in Kentucky. Here's YY describing that.
Mom and Dad had parties, and the Godman Field pilots would come by the house. That was the Black pilot group. You'd hear them talk about their flyings around the United States and the world, and it made me want to fly.
I just need to say, Carol, I love her voice so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, so she decided to become a pilot, and the Godman pilots she met that night, they were all men. But she didn't One thing that is striking me about the whole YY story to date is that the fact that she was a woman doesn't seem to have figured into that. So anyway, but at the time, it seemed like a future in aviation might be possible for a young woman too.
This is Texas, cradle of our Army's Air Force.
With so many male pilots overseas, the U.S. Army Air Force began to recruit women.
And out of those buses are stepping girls. Girls who give a new angle to an Air Force story. They're WASPs.
These girls were known as Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs.
Nobody should ever tell a WASP that flying's not a woman's job. They wouldn't believe it any more than if it was...
But at the time that YY got interested in flying, there were no black WASPs. Mildred Hemmons Carter, a black pilot who trained at Tuskegee, applied and qualified, but was rejected on the basis of race. That didn't stop YY. She had made up her mind. She was going to use her mechanical skills toward aviation. And since all the pilots she talked to had studied engineering, she decided to do the same.
Literally the next day, she went down to Central High School and looked up what their engineering courses were so that she could sign up for them for the next semester.
That's YY's son, Milton Clark.
She had bought her T-square and she bought her protractor and everything that she needed to take the course. And when she went to the classroom, the instructor wouldn't let her in because she was a female.
YY called this her first experience of pure sexism. Why pure? Because, in her words, it made no logical sense. That's something to note about YY. For her, discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was wrong because it defied reason. It's impossible to disentangle YY's ethics, her spirit, and her worldview from her adherence to logic and reason. Her rejection from the school's mechanical drawing course was also completely different from how she was accustomed to being treated at home. Her parents nurtured her ambitions, and when they said no, they had good reason. And it was her parents who, through their tight-knit, talented, diverse community, offered YY a path to the sky. Literally.
Mom had a friend, he had an airplane.
YY's mother got her friend to take them on a flight. Hortense sat in the back, so her daughter could sit in the cockpit next to the pilot.
And he let me take over the controls once he took off, and Mom was on the passenger seat in the back. It was nice.
So that's kind of where it all began.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Back at school, YY found a practical workaround after being rejected from the mechanical drawing class. She signed up to take the course over the summer with a different teacher. Another semester, she took an aeronautics class where she learned about the mechanics of airplanes.
That was cool. We would make planes. You would go out on the fire escape, roll your propeller, and then aim it at the football field and watch it fly.
YY zoomed through high school. After only 2 years, she graduated in the top 25% of her class at Central High School in Louisville. She was only 16. Her parents thought that was too young to start college, so they sent her up north to stay with a family friend and take a few additional courses.
So I went to Boston for 2 years and attended Girls Latin, where I took French and Latin, etc.
2 years later, when she turned 18, it was time to apply to college.
I applied to University of Louisville, down the street from me, University of Illinois at Urbana, and Howard University in Washington, D.C.
According to Milton, her son, YY was accepted at all 3 schools. But after 2 years in Boston, her preference was to stay close to home.
So YY picked the University of Louisville, and as Milton tells it, in 1947, she went to a scheduled orientation with her mother, Hortense, acceptance letter in hand. YY's daughter, Carol, tells us that YY was all set to confirm attendance.
Until they found out she was Black. And then they said, oh no, you can't come.
As in many other times in YY's life, everything was fine until they saw her. As YY herself told her daughter Carol,
I couldn't get in.
Why?
A Black down south.
The University of Louisville was a segregated school.
The major obstacle was called the Day Law.
That's Tom Owen again.
And that had essentially been interpreted as a prohibition against biracial education in both public and private institutions.
Even if the University of Louisville had wanted to enroll YY, at that time in Kentucky, because of the Day Law, it was actually illegal for them to do so.
YY would have been expected to attend the segregated Black undergraduate college where both her parents worked, Louisville Municipal. But Municipal didn't offer the classes that YY needed.
They would have some technical courses, but no, to my knowledge, they did not have a program in engineering at all.
Separate but equal was a fiction, as much in Kentucky higher education as anywhere else. And the NAACP was constantly on the lookout for cases that would prove it.
Beginning in the 1930s, it was clear that the NAACP was pushing to get admission to graduate education in Kentucky.
In 1941, the NAACP had taken on the case of an aspiring engineering student from Louisville named Charles Lamont Eubanks. The state segregated Black college had no engineering program, so Eubanks applied to the local all-white public university and was rejected. In the end, the case was dismissed. Eubanks, or any Black high school graduate in Kentucky who wanted to study engineering, would have to look out of state.
Pretty much everything was set up to encourage YY to either give up on engineering or go to school somewhere else. In fact, in Kentucky,
there was a fund to pay African Americans to go to graduate school out of state. It didn't pay for expenses or living expenses to leave the state, and the fund was frequently depleted.
Not only was the fund insufficient, graduate students were given priority. YY was applying as an undergraduate, so she would have found it difficult to qualify.
But YY had gotten admitted. She had the letter. YY's parents were not going to take this lying down. Remember, this is Hortense we're talking about, NAACP member, journalist. So YY's parents,
being the educated folks that know what our rights are, said, you know what, we'll take you to court, and then we'll decide if she can come.
Hortense threatened to take legal action. She spent several days negotiating directly with the University of Louisville. If her daughter's acceptance letter wasn't going to get her admission, Hortense was going to make sure it got her something.
I asked Mom, well, we live right there in Louisville. Why can't we get room and board? Mom said, leave it alone, honey. Okay. Leave it alone. I said, okay, Mom, you're in charge.
Eventually, they worked out a deal. Louisville would cover YY's tuition at a school that admitted Black students, and the family would agree not to sue the university.
And University of Louisville paid my tuition at Howard University.
We wondered if the University of Louisville had any records from 1947 when YY started school. So we asked Tom to look. He did a lot of digging. 3 days straight of combing through city directories, newspaper clippings, and the university's own archives. And he found a file.
And guess what it was titled? Negro Admissions. Got those 3 goddamn files out. They start in 1948, not 1947. And she's not in there.
But I just couldn't leave it at that. I asked Tom, isn't it possible that the university didn't want this on the record at all? Couldn't the negotiations have happened behind closed doors?
Oh, I don't have any trouble believing that it could have happened. I'm just, my orientation is give me the paper, give me the document. And I wish, if I could live so long, I'd keep on looking.
My question was why she applied there in the first place. I have no doubt that YY's family knew that the University of Louisville was a segregated school. They worked at Municipal, the university's all-Black undergraduate college.
That does not surprise me. Hortense seemed, just looking at the clips, seems intense to me, committed to me, pushing on the edges, challenging things. And so that does not surprise me.
It certainly didn't surprise me either. This well-educated, civically minded Black family is dealing with a rule that says their whip-smart daughter, who wanted to be an engineer, was being denied that opportunity solely because she was Black. When the young saw an unjust rule, they refused to accept it, and they actively challenged it.
Hortense, especially, was just a civic activist in the fullest sense of the word.
YY might well have applied to the University of Louisville, fully knowing how unlikely it was that she would be able to attend. The NAACP was applying this strategy across the country, intentionally exposing and challenging discrimination. This was a template for the civil rights movement. It wouldn't be until 1948, the year after YY applied to the University of Louisville, that the NAACP filed the case that would overturn segregated higher education in Kentucky.
And Lyman Johnson was the successful one.
Lyman Johnson was a social studies teacher and NAACP member in Louisville. He taught at YY School, the segregated Central High School. Unlike YY, he was applying for graduate study, a PhD. It was immediately evident that Kentucky State, a Black undergraduate college, would not provide him with the coursework that a white PhD student would receive at the University of Kentucky. He sued the university in 1948, and in 1949, he won.
This victory didn't make much difference to YY, who was already at Howard by then, but it changed a few things for her family. In fact, soon after YY made her deal with the University of Louisville,
my uncle, her brother, made application.
Milton told us that YY's younger brother also applied to the University of Louisville.
So it was kind of like, okay, here come the youngs again.
This time, the university knew who they were dealing with. Plus, the decision in the Lyman Johnson case had just come out the previous spring, which is how...
It's my uncle, her brother, who broke the color barrier. And my grandmother broke the color barrier at the law school.
That's right. Hortense would later go to law school at the University of Louisville. In 1951, she was one of 4 Black students to enroll.
And that's the thing, we talk about mom, but the family is really the dynamic in play here.
YY's family didn't create her passion, her talents. Those were her own. What her family did do, and what they would continue to do, was make her interests viable in a world that wasn't fair.
There was nothing out of bounds with her parents.
They didn't put obstacles in front of me. They said, if you want it, you will.
I think that's something that we probably, even as a community now, don't give enough credit to. Just how much effort it can take to raise an Yvonne.
Next time on Lost Women of Science, YY leaves the nest. This has been Lost Women of Science. Thanks to everyone who made this initiative happen, including our co-executive producer Amy Sharf, producer Ashreya Gupta, senior editor Nora Matheson, associate producer Sindhuja Srinivasan, composer Elizabeth Yunin, and the engineers at Studio D Podcast Production.
Thank you to Milton H. Clark Sr. Much of the story comes from his book, 6 Degrees of Freedom.
We're grateful to Mike Fung, Kathy Bennett Warner, Dominique Guilford, Jeff Delvicio, Maria Clave, Michelle Nyhaus, Susan Kerr, Jeannie Stivers, Carol Lawson, and our interns, Hilda Gitchell and Hannah Carroll. Thanks also to Paula Goodwin, Nicole Searing, and the rest of the legal team at Perkins Coie. Many thanks to Barnard College, a leader in empowering young women to pursue their passion in STEM.
Thank you to Tennessee State University, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, the University of Louisville, and the University of Alabama in Huntsville for helping us with our search. And a special shout out to the print shop on Martha's Vineyard.
And my closet, where this podcast was recorded. Lost Women of Science is funded in part by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the John Templeton Foundation, which catalyzes conversations about living purposeful and meaningful lives. This podcast is distributed by PRX and published in partnership with Scientific American. You can learn more about our initiative at lostwomenofscience.org or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Find us at Lost Women of Sci. That's Lost Women of SCI. Thank you so much for listening.
I'm Carol Sutton Lewis.
And I'm Katie Hafner.